All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is about 2:05 on my end, at least. So we are going to go ahead and get started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Amanda Sternberg. I'm with the Homeless Action Network of Detroit. I think most folks know me I'm the one that you get all the emails from about the continuum of care, funding, and competition, and all that good stuff. All right, well, thank you all for being here today to talk about the CoC project renewal review process. So we are recording today's meeting. So if you have other staff who may need to, view this later on, the recording will ultimately be posted to HAND's website. So I want to kind of quickly go over what we're going to be talking about here today. So I'm going to start with some housekeeping tips. I'm going to do a quick recap of last year's competition and then answer some questions that folks may have about, I thought we were supposed to have a year off this year. So we're going to kind of bring people up to speed on what's going on there. Then we're going to really talk about sort of the timeline of what we're going to be looking at in the coming months, what we are kind of doing as it relates to reviewing project performance, going to talk a bit about scoring and appeals and all of that good stuff. And then talk a bit about submitting your materials to me. And as we go throughout, feel free to put questions in the chat box. Feel free to raise your hand and come off of mute at any point to ask questions along the way. I would ask that if you're not speaking, that you do just keep yourself on mute, just to cut down on background noise. Like I mentioned, the recording and the slides from today will all be posted to our website. I'll probably get the slides posted by the end of the week. The webinar might take a few more days to get up there. And I will, at the end of the meeting, drop that link in the chat of where you will be able to find all of the materials from today. Okay, so we're going to start with a quick recap of last year's CoC competition, the 2024 CoC competition. So we submitted project applications to HUD, and we submitted the CoC application to HUD last October. HUD made funding announcements on those projects early this year on January 17th, 2025. You may recall also early this year, starting, in like January, February timeframe, there was a lot of back and forth about grant agreements. You also got a lot of emails from me during that time about language and grant agreements, and there was a lot of debacle is the only word that I can come up with getting those grant agreements signed. As of today, those grant agreements are for the most part in place. For the most part, every agency does have their grant agreement for their FY 2024 project term. Anyway, those funding announcements were made in early January. In total, the CoC was awarded about $40 million in funding. That was about almost a 15% increase from the prior year. This chart just gives a high level overview of what we were awarded. Just to, kind of wanted to make the note that the majority of our funding is in a permanent supportive housing, and also the vast majority of our funding is with our renewal projects. But so of the total funding we were awarded, about 37.7 million was in renewal projects. So that represents really kind of all of your programs. We did have one new project that was, one new PSH project that was funded, and then our new CoC planning grant. So again, most of our renewal projects were awarded and received an increased amount. You would have noticed that in your grant agreement that you received kind of a bump in your award due to adjustments that HUD makes every year for fair market rent increases or FMR increases. And then this year, for the first time, HUD also increased supportive services budget lines to account for cost of living increases. We did unfortunately have two renewal projects in last year's competition that were not renewed. They had been ranked in tier 2, and unfortunately they were not selected by HUD for funding. I referenced earlier, we did have one new PSH project that was funded last year. That's a new PSH project for a lighthouse of Oakland County. That project will provide supportive services for a new low-income housing tax credit project that is currently in development. Along with the individual project applications, last year we also submitted the overall CoC application. This is kind of the overarching application that we have to submit to HUD, and it is that application is what HUD scores us on as a CoC, and the higher that we score on that application, the more funding we are able to receive. We received our score on that application in May, and we've been kind of doing an analysis of that score. And that analysis will be going to the CoC board at a future board meeting. It's kind of tentatively scheduled for August. As I referenced earlier, there was some bumpiness earlier this year with those 2024 grant agreements. Some of you may know I have been reaching out directly to your agencies just to confirm the status of your grant agreements, if your agency has received them and or signed them and returned them. So if I do send you an email to that respect, just please respond. But I will say, for the most part, where we're at today, those grant agreements have been received and signed. I know that there are some agencies that have not yet received those grant agreements for projects that have start dates a little bit later in the calendar year. That is typical. HUD does typically prioritize getting out grant agreements for projects that have start dates earlier in the calendar year. So if you have a project that has a start date with like a September, October, well, maybe not September at this point, but like a start date in the fourth quarter of this year, that grant agreement is likely still coming. If you have any specific questions about your grant agreements, those do need to be directed to your HUD rep. Okay, so that's a recap of last year. So this year, the question I know that I have, and maybe that others have, is weren't we supposed to have a year off this year? Well, kind of, yes. So in the 2024 competition, the 2024 Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, that NOFO was essentially a 2-year NOFO. There was, language in that NOFO that essentially indicated that the NOFO was for both 24 and 25. Our understanding at that time, last year, was that there would be no overall CoC competition this year. There would be no national competition, no kind of overall CoC application that would have to be completed. Also, no new project funding. It was also our understanding that HUD would provide some type of mechanism for the CoC to indicate to HUD which projects needed to be renewed for their 26-27 grant terms. So again, last year during this time, and even going into early 2025, it really wasn't clear, would HUD just kind of automatically renew everyone? Would the CoC or the applicant still have to submit something to HUD to, renew your projects for another year? So we were kind of operating with just a lot of, we don't know what's going to happen. HUD will give us more information at some point. So again, and then as kind of we rolled into 2025, particularly as we got later on in the year, into the spring and now into the summer, we were still kind of waiting for more information on, okay, how is this going to look this year? This is the first time that HUD has ever done kind of a 2-year NOFO. The only kind of due date that we had that we were working with at that time was a late August due date that was published in the 2024 NOFO. That late August due date referred to, if CoCs needed to apply, we're going to apply for, reallocated funding, or, projects that hadn't been funded in 2024. So the long and the short of it is, the only due date we had to work with, kind of like to plan against, was a late August due date. So knowing that, in June, we communicated to all of our CoC agencies that even though we didn't really know what was happening, we still were going to move forward with a plan to review the performance of our CoC funded projects and still provide all of those projects with a score, just like you normally do. And really the purpose of that review was to kind of accomplish a few things. One, it was to understand how our projects performed over the course of 2024, to get a sense of what's going well within individual projects and where some improvement needed. The purpose of doing this review is also to kind of get an idea of what are some of the project review elements that we may want to look at or incorporate in 2026. So kind of the next, at that time, our understanding of kind of the next normal competition year. And then lastly, because it was and is still unclear around what the CoC may need to do when it comes to any type of project ranking, we see this being able, doing a review of projects, doing an evaluation, giving projects a score would also provide one piece of information that could be used if projects do need to be ranked when they're submitted to HUD. So that was kind of where we were at throughout the month of June and going into late June. Then on July 3rd, HUD sent out an email that communicated the following. So the HUD did communicate that they do intend to release a 2025 Notice of Funding Opportunity. So a 2025 NOFO, HUD does intend to publish one. And it sounds like there will be that CoC application, that kind of overarching CoC application, CoC competition, like there normally is. That CoC application, that is the process that HAND leads and as our role as the collaborative applicant. So again, while we were anticipating that we would have a year off from that this year, that does not seem to be the case. The email that HUD sent, it was not super detailed, but it did hint at there possibly being an opportunity for new project funding as well when that NOFO is released, specifically for street outreach programs and transitional housing programs. Those were two project types that were specifically mentioned in this email communication from HUD. So as of today, we don't have any additional information from what I have just shared. We don't know any more, timelines, deadlines, what funding is available, what it can be used for, what HUD is looking for. And unfortunately, none of that is available at this point. But we did want to, make sure that that you all were aware that this was the communication that came from HUD. So there will be more communication coming from, from HAND directly as we get more information as well. All right. All right, so I'm just going to kind of keep moving on throughout this presentation. Like I said, feel free at any point along the way to drop questions in the chat. So one of the themes that I should say as well as we go throughout this presentation is that there's going to be a lot of things might change. So for those of you who have perhaps been a part of this application process in the past, you'll know that typically by the time we get to this point, we have kind of clearer timelines laid out, clearer sort of decision points. We know when those decision points are going to be made, and we know what decisions need to be made. One of the things that is going to be different this year as we enter into this is particularly around some of this timeline and the decision-making process. Things may change. So we are kind of presenting this and kind of decided to still roll out our review process using the best information that we have at the time, which was, again, pre that July 3rd email. So here's what we're looking at right now with our timeline. So today is the 10th, and we are having this webinar. Your application materials are going to be due to HAND by noon on the 24th. And I do acknowledge that that is a shorter turnaround time than we do normally have. As we get into the application materials, you will note that we have stripped down some of the questions out of the application in terms of narrative responses that were required in the past are not included this year. We really tried to be intentional about making the materials that you have to complete and submit to us as simple as possible to kind of ease it on your side in terms of what you need to gather to get to us within the next couple of weeks. I did also, in one of my earlier emails to everyone, did give you a heads up on some of the kind of attachments and things that would be required, like your audit reports, your monitoring reports. So hopefully that gave you at least kind of a couple of additional weeks to, start gathering those things so that you hopefully have them a little bit more accessible to kind of get them to us. We'll be going over the application form in some more detail in a minute, but essentially your materials are going to be due July 24th by noon. Our goal then is to get to you your project scores by early August. There will be some form of an appeals process. I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but that will occur kind of throughout mid-August. Once we get into, you'll see late August and into September, there's a lot of TBDs and question marks. So what is not clear at this time is what entry will need to be done into eSnaps for your renewal projects. At this point, I'm assuming something will need to be entered into eSnaps. I don't know what yet. I don't know when. Certainly that will be communicated at the time that we do know that. I would say, just to make sure that the appropriate people at your agency do have access to eSnaps. If you don't already, that's always something to, keep up on. So again, for our purposes here, July 24th at noon, that is when your materials are due to me. And I've kind of just to really drive this point home, anything that's received after 12 o'clock p.m. or noon will be considered late and points will be reduced accordingly. So I would really ask that you not wait until the last minute to try to hit send on that email. Everyone has been doing pretty good at that over the past couple of years, but really encourage you to not wait until the last minute and really get that stuff into us, before that deadline. So additional things that are still to come now that we know that it sounds like there will be some new project funding available. Folks may be wondering, when is the application process for that? Today we're just talking about renewal projects. We don't have any more information at this point because we don't know with certainty, what types of new projects we can apply for. Like I said earlier, we had not been planning on there being any funding available for new projects. So we had really, before July 3rd, had been assuming that there would be no opportunity to apply for new funding. So now that we have a different understanding, we'll just have to kind of wait and see for more information to come once we have that from HUD. Likewise, when the CoC board will be making final funding decisions on what's being submitted to HUD, how things are being ranked, that is all still to come. I don't have a clear timelines at this point on when that is all going to take place. So more to come. I will say, for those of you, again, who have been around for a while, you may know that we typically do have things very much more clearly scheduled out. So I don't want to say my anxiety is rising a little bit with all of these unknowns, but just a little bit because things are not going according to plan, but we're just going to take it as it comes. So I am going to switch over to walk through the actual packet of information and just show you, this is what I sent out earlier this week. But let me get to that just a moment. And while I do that, I will note the question in the chat box from Kim. So what are my thoughts about the work, treatment, and sobriety requirements that were hinted at in HUD's email? Both impacts on programming and possible impacts for the application. Yes, so what Kim is referring to, so in HUD's email, they referenced that in the CoC application itself, so again, this is kind of the overall application that we will have to submit to HUD, that it looks like HUD is going to be looking for more information on how within our programs there are these different kind of, requirements or expectations around, helping people to get employed, seeking treatment, sobriety, all of that. There's a lot of unknowns. I wish I could have a clear answer. I think on the one hand, what we saw in that email, and again, really, when we talk about this email, there's like 2 lines really that are, or 2 to 4 lines that were really of any substantive information. So it's not like we got a lot of details from HUD. I think on the one hand, what we are seeing or what is being hinted at are things that we did expect in a way, considering what we have heard about, the priorities of the new administration. So on the one hand, it wasn't a surprise to see some of this. I think in a way there was an expectation that this type of language would be coming eventually. I think there was the hope that we would still have a year off and that we wouldn't see some of this until 2026, and then we'd have a little bit more time to maybe get a better understanding of what is to be expected. So it's really hard to predict at this point, to be honest. Hard to predict on what this is going to mean for, how HUD is going to evaluate the CoC on the CoC application, on this competition. It's hard to really know what this is going to mean for individual projects, what it's going to mean for, our competitiveness for this funding. That's something certainly to keep in mind, that the CoC competition is a competition. The Detroit CoC is essentially competing against 400 other CoCs around the country for these funds. And in the NOFO every year, HUD lays out the evaluation criteria that they evaluate your CoC against to determine how well you're performing. And then that score, again, as I mentioned earlier, determines how much funding you receive. So we are anticipating that when we do get this NOFO, that evaluation criteria on what they're going to be looking at for CoCs likely will reference, some of these elements like treatment, sobriety, that it has not in the past. But again, what that's going to look like, what that will mean, it's really hard to say. So we're just, which I know is not really helpful. It makes it difficult to know like how to predict or how to plan. So until we know more, we're going to kind of continue forward as we can. I will say when we get to, and we're going to kind of look at some of the details of those elements that we are going to be evaluating your projects on this year. And I think what you will see is that, number one, we are keeping it very focused on the data, and we're keeping it focused on those primary key criteria that I think we would all agree homeless projects should be addressing, such as housing stability, increasing income and employment, those elements that we have always looked at within your programs, no matter who was in office. So let's maybe take a closer look at some of that. So this document that I'm showing now is the renewal application materials. Again, this is posted on our website, and this is what I sent out earlier this week. I'm not going to go through this document word by word, primarily because I've already covered some of it, and I know that you can all review it on your own. What I am going to skip to is the scoring criteria. So I think that's probably what folks are keenly interested in. So there are very, very few changes made this year. The majority of the changes that we've made to this scoring criteria is to remove or kind of set aside for this year, again, some of those narrative elements that I referred to. We do have a couple of modified or new criteria. I'll just briefly touch on those. The first is the modified scoring criteria. This is going to apply to all projects, and it has to do with the scoring elements where essentially negative points could be assigned to your project if for outstanding or unresolved audit or monitoring findings. In many cases, this doesn't apply to folks. If you get an audit finding or a monitoring finding, for the most part, you clear those up, you're good to go, and everything's great. But we do have, again, just as a way to make sure that agencies are addressing those findings and taking the steps they need to remedy them. We do have language around points being deducted from your score if anything is outstanding or not resolved. So that really the change we made this year was clarifying some of that language. In the past, the language used to say that up to 2 points could be reduced for any one of the kind of things that we were looking at. We simplified that to say 2 points could be reduced. So just to make it clear that there's not going to be kind of a scale there. And we also just clarified that for your financial audits that we remove the word unresolved because we know that there could be a time where you submit your agency's financial audit and perhaps there is a finding that over the next year, your agency is going to take the time to put in place the policies, procedures that you need to address the issue. And then when your auditor comes out next year, they will hopefully see this is not a repeat finding. The agency took care of things. So because of some of the timing issues that can kind of come up with that, it made more sense to focus for your financial audits to look more at repeat findings. And so we just clarified some of that language there. And I see Rebecca's question about the monitoring findings are the monitoring findings relevant only for the grant that is being applied for renewal. So for Rebecca, who works for the state, yes. I would say for monitoring findings, you are going to need to submit any monitorings from HUD for your CoC funded programs. And we do have a specific, like from March of last year to March of this year. So we don't need like the entire history. But if your agency also receives City of Detroit funding for homeless programs, so if you receive ESG, CDBG, homeless solutions funding, we do want those monitoring reports as well. So not calling out Rebecca, but Rebecca works for the state. State of Michigan does not receive those city funds, but some of you on our call do. So if you do receive city funding, we are going to want those city funding for homeless programs. So like your emergency shelter or rapid rehousing or street outreach, we do want those monitoring reports as well. And this is all detailed in the application materials on what needs to be submitted. So that's the only scoring criteria that we changed a little bit. And then there are 2 criteria that we added, and these only apply to the coordinated entry grant that HAND holds as the CAM lead agency. This grant was transferred to HAND initially a couple of years ago when HAND took over the role as the CAM lead agency. So we are incorporating 2 new scored criteria for this grant. I'll just touch on them briefly here. They are kind of detailed, again, in more detail in the application materials, but we are going to be scoring on the accuracy of HCV applications that are submitted to the MISTA portal. That sounds really, I know that's kind of a technical thing, but in part of the role, HAND's role as the HARA, one of those tasks is to submit those homeless preference HCV applications to MISTA. MISTA has a process by which they audit that piece of work. And so we are kind of applying those audits to HAND in this scoring criteria. We are also going to be using as a scored criteria proportional points from the CoC application in 2024 for the responses that we gave around our community's coordinated entry system. This is similar to what we do for our direct HMIS grant, where we essentially are applying the score that HUD gives us in the CoC application around coordinated entry implementation and taking that score and applying it locally. Again, in the application materials, there are more details around what that looks like, what that means. And we do also talk in the packet of information about plans for future evaluation criteria and what we think that could look like for the coordinated entry grants. Okay. I see another question about the monitoring reports. For those City of Detroit monitoring reports that you might have, we want both financial and program monitoring. So yeah, so both of them. Thanks, Jean. Okay. So this chart here that I'm showing is really a summary of these scoring criteria. As I said, anything that is in red is new or modified from last year. So you're going to notice, again, only those three things that I touched on earlier are new or modified. We'll talk a little bit later about the deducting points for late or incorrect submissions. I want to kind of walk through some of these, the details of what we are going to be scoring you on. Again, nothing has changed from last year. The scoring scales are the same. The point values are the same. How we are getting this data is the same. The measures themselves are the same. So everything is the same. And that was, again, that was intentional. We wanted to really focus this year on those data elements. We wanted to be intentional about not making a lot of changes given kind of the short time frame that we understood that we were under and sort of this unknown environment that we were working in. So the focus was really on keeping things as very much the same as we could. So the first set of evaluation criteria are outcomes related to increasing income and employment. So there's a set of measures there. There are some differences in the scoring scales from PSH versus RAPID and our joint component projects. So if you're reviewing this, just make sure you're looking at the scoring scale that applies to your project type. But like we always have in the past, we're going to be looking at the extent to which people leave with any cash income, people who leave with non-cash benefits, people who leave with earned income in employment. We'll be looking at the rate at which people increase their income and employment. And then for permanent supportive housing programs, we're looking at people who, the stayers in your program who have health insurance. I don't know if I said this earlier, so I'll mention it now, but for all of this evaluation, we are looking back on calendar year 2024. So when we talk about what we're looking at, the data we're looking at calendar year 2024 data. So who you served last year. So I know, there's probably a lot of conversations now happening around what is the future going to look like, particularly maybe around health insurance, right? With people being able to get Medicaid or get SNAPs benefits, with all the discussions that are happening in Congress with the budgeting. When those change, when we start to see things, come to fruition with those changes, those will be taken into consideration in future years. But again, we are looking back on 2024. So just to kind of keep that in mind. So again, everything the same there with the income and employment outcomes. The second component has to do with housing. So housing performance and quality, again, these are the same as we've had in prior years. For permanent supportive housing, we're going to be looking at the rates to which people either stay in your program over the course of 2024, or if they exit, where they exit to, and if they exited to other permanent housing. We do for both, let me clarify then, for rapid rehousing and joint component project types, we're only looking at exits because those are, time limited programs. As we do every year, we always exclude certain people from those calculations. I give some details here. There will be additional details on how we do those exclusions in the self-scoring tools. We have also gone into even more details on how we do these calculations in the PSH. I think we did in the rapid rehousing work group as well. So we have kind of a video recorded, which I will make sure is posted on our linked on our website if you want to go really into the weeds on how we do these housing outcome calculations. But just know that there are certain folks that we do exclude from these calculations based on their exit destination, or if they have an entry and an exit but no housing move-in date, because sometimes you get a referral, you start working with the person, and then you never end up moving them into housing, they are excluded as well. But again, the measure themselves of what we're looking at is the same as last year. Likewise, for utilization rates, we will be looking at 5 different points in time over the course of 2024 to see the number of households who are enrolled in your program compared to the number of units that you're funded to provide, and we take that overall average. that's the same as last year. We really want to see projects being at that like 90% rate over the course of the year. And we do take into consideration if projects are ramping up over the course of 2024, we know that's going to look different. And so we make some modifications there. Okay, part C, for length of time from referral to housing move-in. So this measure is the same as last year as well. The time frames have changed a little bit. So note on how we kind of pull together this data. So every year when we incorporate this as a scored element, we look at the overall average length of time that it took to move people into housing for that year. And for PSH projects, we break it down into 3 different project types as well: scattered site programs, project-based programs that have project-based vouchers, and project-based programs that do not have project-based vouchers. It's because we know those are kind of the three main buckets of project types that we have, and they can vary significantly on how long it takes to move people in. So we essentially evaluate like projects with like projects. But every year we look at this data, and so the timeframes that you are scored against are unique to every year. So if you were to pull up last year's application materials, you're going to see different average days, and these scoring scales are going to look different because those were the averages that we were looking at over the course of 2023. These are now the averages that we're looking at over the course of 2024. So this is a piece of the data that we do essentially kind of update every year. But the kind of the logic behind the scales remains the same every year in terms of your project can earn full points if you are performing better than average. You can earn half points if you're kind of in that average range, or not more than a few days above average. You can earn about a third of the points if you're within kind of 2 weeks of the average. And then if you're more than 2 weeks, if your project average is more than 2 weeks from the average, you would get 0 points. As we did last year as well, for this measure, we do allow for what we call improvement points, where if your project earned 0 points on this component in last year's competition, and if you would, according to these scales, earn 0 points this year, but if you made an improvement of at least 10%, you can earn 2 points. So, and we do kind of these calculations on our end. We look at what you scored last year, what you would score this year, to determine if you get those improvement points. But this is something we started doing last year, just in acknowledgement that some projects may struggle with this measure, but if they are showing, forward improvement, we do want to acknowledge that and kind of reward that. So that's what we started incorporating last year. For returns to homelessness, again, this measure is the same as we've done last year. So the scale is the same. As we do discuss in the self-scoring tools, this is a little bit of a more complicated measure. It might be a little bit more difficult for you, as an individual provider to be able to kind of do a self-score on, because it requires being able to see kind of if someone entered into the homeless system at any point, within the 6 months after they leave your program. We certainly are able to pull that data and analyze that data on our end. As with length of time, there is, kind of an improvement score that can be earned for this one too, along the same kind of logic. If you earned 0 points for it last year, and if you would normally earn 0 points for it this year, but if you showed some improvement of 3%, you could earn at least 1 point. So again, for that same kind of logic there. So those are all of the housing outcomes. In the document, we have them kind of broken out by PSH versus rapid. So I'm just going to kind of scroll through these next pages, but they're really kind of essentially they are the same. Okay, I see Jamie's question. If no one was served in 2024, how would this look, right, for Campbell? So it might feel a little awkward. I do have this in the instructions. I'm still going to ask you to run an APR for Campbell, even though, and not for the pending bin, but for the regular bin. for 2024, even though I know it is going to come out with probably 0 people. So it is going to feel awkward, but we're still going to ask for that just as a way to have some kind of consistency amongst our programs. But also, Jamie, happy to talk with you more about that separately if needed. Okay. For financial performance, so again, this is the same as in prior years. We are going to be looking at your most recently completed grant term and assigning a score based on how much of your grant has been expended. I've already pulled all this data from Sage, the online reporting system where you put this data. Appendix A and these application materials provides all of that information. So you can go to this application, these materials, and see that percentage of your most recently completed grant term, what you expended, and how you'll score on that. If you do see anything in that appendix that looks incorrect, please let me know sooner rather than later. Again, I did pull everything directly from Sage and from your APRs that were submitted there. So if it's wrong in the appendix, it's probably wrong in Sage. And so it might need to be corrected on a couple of points. Part B here, this is what I referenced earlier, where points may be deducted if there are unresolved or outstanding audit or monitoring findings. Component 4, this is all HMIS compliance. This is all the same kind of elements that we've looked at in the past. So there will be a score that can be earned for attendance at the HMIS agency admin meetings. I'll get that information directly from our HMIS staff. As we've done in the years past, when we do cancel an agency admin meeting and we replace that with what we call an e-blast or kind of an e-newsletter in place of the meeting, you will kind of automatically get credit for that meeting. So we had a number of those kind of e-blasts in places of meetings this year. So hopefully these will be easy points for agencies to earn. For components B, C, and D in this section on HMIS, which is looking at various elements of data quality and completeness, accurate reporting of your annual assessment, and known exit destinations. We are going to be looking for this data, not just your CoC program that's being renewed, but we're going to be looking at all of the projects that you report to an HMIS. The caveat to that I will note is that if you are here as the direct recipient of a grant and you have a subrecipient, for that score, that will only be scored on that one subrecipient grant. So for example, we're not going to hold you as the recipient accountable for all of your subrecipients' data, like their shelter data or their, other data. That is also detailed in these materials. But for the most part, most of the agencies here don't necessarily have that recipient-subrecipient relationship. So what do we mean by this? So if you're an agency and you have a CoC program or multiple CoC programs, and maybe you have a shelter program or two, and you have a city-funded rapid rehousing program, and maybe you have another program that you enter into HMIS for, as long as it's not warming center or street outreach, and there may be a couple of other exceptions as well, we're going to be looking at those programs when we look at your data quality and completeness, when we look at the extent to which you are accurately recording those annual assessments and getting those done, and the extent to which people are exiting to known destinations. So for these elements, our HMIS staff will run those reports. You don't need to run anything. You don't need to submit anything. We have those provider groups and we're going to run those reports. So again, you don't need to turn anything into us. Our team takes care of that. What I do include in the application materials in this Appendix C is that you will see all of your projects, all of your agency's projects that are going to be included in that run. So if you're wondering, how does my shelter program, how is it going to look? Or what programs are going to be included? That is detailed in that appendix, so you can look and see and know kind of which programs we include. And some questions in the chat regarding that. So again, we run each provider will have their own kind of provider group that APR is generated on. And in terms of handling the data chatter, my understanding, I think Nona's here. So this might be a question I need Nona to answer, is that because we are running it essentially at our level, it helps to mitigate some of that data chatter. Again, that's part of the reason why we run them rather than have the individual agencies run them, just because the level of access that we have to that data, if that helps. So, I will say, for the most part, and this is what we have been evaluating projects like this for a number of years. By and large, I want to give kind of you all credit for doing a really great job on keeping your data up to date, complete, entering those data elements. For the most part, this data, it looks really good when not always perfect, but it looks really good. So you have definitely been intentional about responding to the requests of our HMIS staff for these data entry elements. Okay. Part E in this is going to be looking at timely submission of your housing inventory chart. So these were to be submitted, these were all due last February. We keep track of whether or not everything was submitted on time. And again, this timely submission is referring to not just your CoC funded program, but if you had to submit a HIC for, again, a shelter program, a city funded rapid rehousing program, what have you, we're going to look at the extent to which you submitted everything on time that needed to be submitted. And so we'll be doing, that analysis based on our records of the submission. All right, for part F, this was incorporated, I think, for the first time, I don't know, if in 2024, it may have been in 2023. This is where, so every quarter, there is a quarterly point in time housing move-in date audit process that is completed, where you receive information, you receive a report from our HMIS staff. You are then asked to review, correct, confirm that that data, for that quarter is accurate and complete. That housing movement dates are done. Anyone who's entered needs to be entered has been entered. Anyone who needs to be exited has been exited. All of that. Again, these quarterly reports, quarterly audits are one way that we are able to kind of regularly checking and keeping up on the data and making sure that we're not kind of falling behind on what needs to be entered, who needs to be entered, who needs to be exited, that sort of thing. So what we've been incorporating in this evaluation criteria is really going back and looking to see if any changes were made to that data for a given quarter after it was indicated to us that the data was complete and final. So the materials give some details on how that will be done. Essentially, we're going to pick one of these 4 pit dates, and we're going to rerun the APR for that date for your project and see if it's the same as what it was when, last year when you confirmed that that data was the same. If it's different and, if it looks like things were changed after we were told that this data is final, then that may result in a loss of points. With some caveats, we know that sometimes things happen, particularly with client transfers, that may result in a change in that data. We detail out kind of how those are handled. So this is a report that we run on our end. And, when we need to, we can do some investigating to see is there kind of a legitimate reason of why this data needed to be changed, and we take that into consideration. But really the point of this, including this as a scored criteria, is just to make sure that it's kind of as an accountability factor, that when you as a provider tell us that, yes, this data for my PSH program for this quarter is complete and good, we expect that to be accurate and true. I should have referenced this part F, part F will only apply to PSH and rapid rehousing programs as well. Part E will apply to any non-CoC funded PSH or rapid rehousing programs. Part G. It's the same scoring criteria, the same process. Just this one won't apply to everyone here because not everyone has, a non-CoC funded PSH or rapid rehousing program that this would apply to. But if it does apply, it's the same kind of process. Okay. Part 5, this is looking at inclusion of persons with lived experience in homelessness. So this is one where we have, for this year, removed a couple of scored elements. This year, what we are just going to be focusing on is looking at, and again, this is what we've done in the past, documentation that you have someone on either your agency's board of directors or another kind of decision-making entity, whether that's like a program policy committee or some other kind of entity, policy-making entity within your agency, looking to see that you have a person with lived experience of homelessness in that role. So you can document that through a board roster, through meeting minutes that clearly identifies that individual, or if some agencies keep that information confidential, so you can also provide a letter on agency letterhead stating that. This is consistent with what we've done in the past, so no changes there. What we have removed for this year is, last year we had 2 narrative responses that required you to speak to how your agency incorporated people with lived experience in your programming or in your staffing structures. Again, just kind of due to the time frame that we're under, we're setting aside those narrative responses for this year. So those are not questions that you'll have to answer in this year's application. There are negative points that may be assigned to your agency if you had any substantiated grievances filed in 2024. Appendix D in the application materials does give more details on that. So you can kind of reference that there, but just know there's kind of different levels on where substantiated grievances may cause a reduction in points for your programs. All right, component 6 is looking at participation in coordinated entry. So these again are the same as last year. We're looking at referral outcome reporting. This is looking at the extent to which when you get that referral from CAM that you're completing that outcome reporting, whether it's been accepted, I think it's accepted, declined, or canceled, one of those 3 options that you have. We will be looking at that for both your CoC funded program and again, any other projects you have that receive referrals from CAM. And this is, detailed, again, kind of referring to that Appendix C. We'll be looking to see that anyone new client entries into your program over the course of 2024 that they were referred from CAM. We can also tell, if an individual was transferred into your program from another project, that is certainly, not counted against you at all is what I'm trying to say. So really, by and large, this is a scoring element that we've had for a couple of years just as a way to ensure that providers are only entering folks into their program that are coming through coordinated entry. Really, by and large, agencies, you all have been scoring 100% on this element for many, many years, but we still keep it as a way to hold agencies accountable for that. And we will be looking at the housing move-in date completion, just to ensure that those housing move-in dates are completed. There are some elements to this where for our DV funded programs, we'll need to self-report this in the application materials, and I'll get to that when we kind of get to it in a minute. We have some specific scoring criteria for the direct HMIS grant that HAND receives. Again, this is detailed here in terms of what we're looking at and how that is evaluated. It just looks a little bit different because we are implementing the HMIS. And so we look at different reports and different technical assistance that's provided there for coordinated entry. All right, component 7 applies to Component 7 is for our CAM lead, so that's HAND, and our implementing partner, CHS. So the scoring elements for CHS, those are the same as it has been in the past regarding looking at different data elements related to their work in providing navigation services. So not going to go through over the details there, but for those of you from CHS who are on the call, if you have any questions about this afterwards, happy to talk more. But again, it's the same as it has been in years past. And I already touched on the 2 scored components for HAND in our role as the CAM lead agency. We have the scored component for the HMIS grant. Again, this is the direct HMIS grant that HAND receives, and how we apply the points from the CoC application to kind of our local process here. That again is the same that we've done in years past. Lastly, I want to talk about bonus points. So we did bonus points last year. We're doing bonus points again this year. So you can earn 3 bonus points if you submitted at least 3 of the quarterly audits over the past year. If you submitted at least 3 of them on time, you can earn 3 bonus points. So I gave some details on how bonus points are factored in. Essentially, it's like extra credit. It means that technically your project could score more than 100% if you get all the points possible plus the bonus points. So this is just kind of another way to, sort of boost your score if needed. Okay, I'm gonna skip ahead again to some of the renewal criteria that were removed for this year. I've already touched on this, but there were some kind of self-reported questions in the PSH application around service availability and referrals. We're just setting those aside for this year. We're setting aside points for the unsheltered point in time count participation because we did not have an unsheltered PIT in 2025. And I already referenced this, but all narrative responses, both those regarding incorporating people with lived experience in your programming. And last year we had a narrative response for DV providers as well about increasing people's safety. We're just putting those aside for this year also. Again, due to the time frame that we're under and the time it takes to review those narrative responses, we're just putting them on hold for this year. However, it doesn't mean they won't come back in a future year. So we're just setting them aside for 2025. The application materials do also give some details around how we're going to handle YHDP, our Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program grants for this year. You can kind of read those materials there, but it goes into some details around how YHDP projects will still receive a project score, but the plan is to still submit them for funding for their 26-27 grant term. So if you are a YHDP recipient, please be sure to review that. Anyone can review it, obviously. Just wanted to point out that language is there. I do want to be sure to move on to the application form itself. So I'm going to kind of skip over some of these details again, because I know you can review that on your own. I do want to talk through what it is that you have to actually complete and submit by July 24th. So again, we really tried to keep this as straightforward and as simple as possible. There is one overall organizational application that you're going to have to complete. And this is posted in a Word format on our website, so you can access it there. So there's one overall organizational application with these attachments. You only need to submit one of each of these attachments as they apply. So your agency's audit, your A133 audit, if that applies to you, your most recently completed agency financial audit. And then again, if you have those monitoring reports from the City of Detroit or from HUD dated between March of 2024 and March of 2025, those need to be submitted as well. And then the documentation of participation of homeless or formerly homeless individual. I will also note that this homeless or formerly homeless participation applies to both a recipient and a subrecipient. So if you are the direct recipient and if you have a subrecipient, you're going to be submitting documentation for both because this is a regulatory requirement that applies to both of you. So if you are, again, if you are a recipient, be sure to get this documentation from your subrecipient and include it in your packet of information when you submit it to me. So the form itself is very straightforward. I mean, it's going to ask for information, and if you have monitoring reports from the city, you're just going to kind of go through, check yes or no if you have them, or maybe you don't. It may not apply to you. Same thing with HUD monitoring. I know that, I think the pace at which HUD has been doing their monitoring has perhaps slowed a little bit over the past year. So it's possible that you don't have any reports from, again, we're just looking from March of 2024 to March of 2025. Those are the timeframes that we're looking at. Question 3 just asks, again, to confirm if you have that documentation for someone with lived experience on your board. So that's it for the organizational application. And then for your renewal project application, you're going to complete one of these for every renewal project you have that's being renewed. So you may have 1, you may have 3, however many renewal projects you have. Again, this form is pretty straightforward. It's going to ask for some basic information. This checklist, again, is going to be specific to the renewal project that you're submitting. So you're going to need to generate a calendar year APR for the project. Be sure it's calendar year 2024, which may be different than the project term itself. If there were any significant changes to your project, approved by HUD, there's a question that asks about that. And then I'm just asking for documentation for that change. And lastly, the signature page. And again, the signature page needs to be signed by both the recipient and the subrecipient. So if you have a recipient and a subrecipient, you'll be submitting 2 signature pages, or however many subs you have on the project. There needs to be a signature page signed by each of those subrecipients. I want to point out a couple of things, a couple of the questions in this application. So questions 3 and 4, you'll see these apply to our DV funded projects specifically. We have 3 domestic violence projects that don't report into HMIS. They use comparable databases. So because of that, while DV projects will still need to generate an APR from their comparable database, there's these 2 questions that we don't have access to because it's not in the typical HMIS system. So for DV funded projects, these are 2 questions that you will just need to answer based on your internal records. If you're not a DV funded project, just skip these questions altogether. Obviously, you can either write NA, you can leave them blank, whatever floats your boat. Questions 5 through 8 are going to apply to CHS only as one of our CAM implementing partners. These questions are, again, the same as what they have been in years past. So, CHS is the only one that has to answer those. If you are not CHS answering those questions, you can just skip them. You can either, again, write NA, just leave them blank, just skip them. All right, the attachment 14, this is the signature page. So I thought there was a couple of questions in there about the signature page. So I need I'm going to answer Katie's question first. So I need a signature page for each project. So if you have more than one project, I need a signature page for each project. And we really tried to emphasize that by putting on the page a specific line for the project. I realize this may feel redundant, right? If you have 2, 3, 4 projects and you're signing 2, 3, 4 of these same pages, but it really helps us for just kind of accountability purposes. If something would ever come up in the future with one of your projects where maybe we needed to point to something about, hey, you did sign off on X, Y, and Z for this project, we have something specific to kind of point to. So I realize it might feel a little redundant. Maybe in the future we'll come up with a better way of doing it. But for now, it is one signature page for each project. And again, we really tried to also emphasize that. If I scroll back up to the checklist for the your renewal project application, the project application checklist, you'll see the signature page is listed here. So because you're going to be doing one of these project applications for each of your project, you'll be completing this checklist and the appropriate, documents for each of those projects. So Matt's question, the signature page still references the equal access rule. Yes, it probably does, because the equal access rule is still something that we expect our agencies to adhere to. So we expect compliance with that. In terms of a consolidated project, so that's a great question, Jean. So a few agencies have consolidated projects over the past year, and this is probably going to be particularly if you have on the APR side of things. So I'm going to use Neighborhood Legal Services as an example because Jean asked the question. So NLS has consolidated 2 of their permanent supportive housing projects to whereas in the past it was 2 projects, 2 grant applications, 2 APRs, 2 everything. It's now 1. They have 1 grant agreement, and eventually there will just be 1 HMIS spin. That switchover process is still happening. So for that instance, NLS will submit 1 application for that 1 PSH project. When it comes to the APR, you can do one of 2 things. You can create, and this is also, I think, detailed in the project in the materials. You can create your own provider group that combines those 2 kind of bins into 1 bin, put them in 1 bin and run 1 APR, or you can run 2 separate APRs, 1 APR for the 1 project, another APR for the other project, and submit both of those APRs, and then I can combine the data on my end. So there's a couple of different ways you can do that. And once you get into it, I'm happy to kind of talk through that some more if needed. Okay. The rest of this document, the appendices A, B, C, and D, just again, I've kind of referenced some of them earlier. It gives more kind of supplemental information about the applications, the scoring, all of that. So you can certainly, that information is there for you to review. One other thing I want to point out is that if you are a subrecipient, say, you are, well, you would either be probably a subrecipient of the state or of DWIN, or if you are a YHDP recipient, you are a subrecipient of HAND. I'm going to be looking for all of these application materials from the recipient. So because the recipient is the one who puts their name on that grant agreement with HUD, they are the ones that are applying for the funding. So the recipient is the one who needs to get everything to me on time. So as a recipient, if you are a subrecipient, let me say that the recipient, so the state, the DWIN or HAND may be approaching you and saying, hey, I need document X, Y, and Z from you. I need an APR. I need the signature page. I need something from you for you to submit to me so that I can submit it to HAND. So if they do that, please respond accordingly. If you are the subrecipient, please do not send things to me directly. Again, I'm going to be looking for the information to come from the recipient. So again, if you have questions as you get into it, you can always, reach back out as well. Okay. Any questions, any other questions on the applications itself? Okay, I will keep going. So, some kind of further clarification. So projects that are expiring in calendar year 2026 are eligible for renewal and are the ones that I'm going to be looking for this material from. So we do have, again, we had that new project that was funded, the new PSH project with Lighthouse that was funded. That is a 3-year grant. I guess I'm calling out Lighthouse in particular here. That project is not coming up for renewal this year. And it'd be whoever's here from Lighthouse, I saw someone here. Happy to, I will, can clarify this as well offline, but there's no need to kind of submit any materials because they're not expiring in 2026. That is the only grant that we have that is as a multi-year grant term, and it won't be expiring for another couple of years. Everyone else on this call, all of our other projects, you are on that 12-month cycle where every year you need to apply for renewal funding. Your current grant agreements that you have or that you are going to be receiving end in 2026. So you do need to go through this process to be considered for funding for your 26-27 grant term. So renewal funding is not guaranteed. We say this every year and just want to make sure that that is clear. We wish we could always guarantee continued funding for every project indefinitely. We just cannot. We particularly kind of in this environment, we don't know what funding is going to be available this year. As we know more, we will communicate that. But as we say every year, renewal funding cannot be guaranteed. We do assume, but again, don't know with certainty if projects are going to have to be ranked, in that kind of tier 1, tier 2 process. We're assuming we'll need to do that again this year. We don't know with certainty. So those policies really have not been developed. As they are developed, they'll go before the board for approval. And I'm going to talk in a minute about how we're going to handle this year projects that score under threshold or under that 70%. Okay. So we have projects that may be first or second time renewals. So those are projects that either had fewer than 12 months of operation in 2024 or had not yet begun operations at all. This kind of references, I think, Jamie's earlier question about Campbell. You do still need to submit this application as this is the typo, this should say 2026, because again, you do have a current grant term that is ending in 2026. So I realize it's going to feel a little awkward because you kind of have like barely gotten started, but we do still need these materials to be submitted. Okay, so this just goes into, again, kind of some details. As I mentioned earlier, we're looking back over calendar year 2024. We were really intentional about not making changes to the evaluation criteria this year. And because of that, we did not hold a public comment period like we typically do when we look at evaluation criteria. But again, given the time frame that we were under, and given the fact that there were just so few changes made, we just carried forth with the criteria that we had used in prior years. Okay. I'm going to talk a minute about scoring, appeals, and reallocation. Apparently, I didn't really know how to title this section, so I just lumped it all together. So again, I'm referring back to all of the unknowns that we had about the 2025 application process, particularly the unknowns pre-July 1st, July 3rd, when we were putting these materials together. So the board has approved some changes to the policy and process that's going to be used this year for projects that are scoring under threshold, that's kind of under that 70% threshold mark. So in a typical year, projects that score under threshold or score less than 70% would not be submitted to HUD, but rather they would be reallocated unless an appeal was granted. So they would kind of have to go through that appeals process. And if the appeal was not granted, then they would be reallocated and the project would not be submitted to HUD. And those reallocated funds would be used to fund new projects. So again, given the unknowns that we had and kind of do still have at the time, the CoC board has approved sort of the following kind of fourfold process for appeals and reallocation for this year. So the first point is that after your project receives your score, there are still a few elements that you will be able to appeal if you choose to. So these are really, if you feel your score was calculated incorrectly, if we did the math wrong, if we used didn't use the right data from your APR, if we did a calculation error, that can be appealed. You can demonstrate what the correct score should have been. if your score was wrongly impacted by late or incorrect submission of materials, and you can demonstrate it, you really did turn the correct things in on time, that can be appealed as well. So that is, again, consistent with prior years, and that is still holding true. So if a project scores under threshold or scores less than 70%, for the moment, what this language is saying is that the project would be ranked at the bottom of the ranking list. And if it is funded by HUD, it would be placed on a corrective action plan, but it would not be reallocated in 2025. That then leads to the third point, meaning that there would be no threshold appeals process because there would be no reallocation. But the biggest point to keep in mind is this fourth aspect to this policy, which says that if HUD releases a revised 2025 NOFO that either extends the deadline past August and or gives us more information about a 2025 process, this current plan for no reallocation and no threshold appeals will be revisited and may be revised. So I realize this probably feels really clunky, and I acknowledge that it is a little clunky. This policy and this recommendation was developed with our funding and performance committee, again, late June, before we had any notice from HUD that anything was going to be different this year. So we put this policy in place, which is approved by the board, with the acknowledgement and with the language knowing that we may need to revisit this pending more information from HUD. But again, we needed to kind of move forward with the best information that we had at the time. And this was based on the best information we had at the time and really still that we currently have. So I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that this is the language that we are currently going with right now, but noting that because it does, HUD, as they said, they do intend to release a NOFO, so this may change. When what may change mean the board may make different decisions about reallocation or about how we're going to handle projects that may fall under that 70% threshold. For now, this is the language that we're going with. If or when changes come about, again, those will be any recommended changes to this policy will first start within our funding and performance committee and ultimately go to the board for their review and vote. So we do try to be certainly transparent about that process. And if there are any changes that are made, we will certainly communicate that accordingly. Okay, so this is just a summary, again, of what this language currently says. You'll still be able to appeal any, let's call it kind of a clerical or a math error. If we make any errors there, you can still appeal that. That's not any different. Again, the biggest change is that if a project scores under that 70% threshold, that the project right now, as it stands, would not be reallocated. So there would be no threshold appeals process, but rather the project would be ranked at the bottom of the list. And again, this is all subject to change pending more information from HUD. So I'm just going to take it as it comes and take it one day at a time. Okay, this is really kind of summarizing everything that I just said as well. Okay, I'm going to talk a minute about some kind of key things to keep in mind regarding submission of materials. So applicants have lost points in the past for not submitting the correct materials on time. If everything is submitted late, there will be so many points deducted that it may be difficult or mathematically impossible for your project to kind of pass that scoring threshold. So please be sure to get everything in on time. And please, as you're going through these application materials, if it's not clear what needs to be submitted, please reach out and ask a question. I would rather get those questions and clarify things than have you make an assumption and make the wrong assumption about what needs to be submitted. When you do submit your materials, you will receive an email confirmation just noting that I got what you submitted, but it's not confirming that your documents have been reviewed. I will typically get dozens of emails on July 24th, or hopefully before. So I do try to respond as soon as I can, just to let you know, got your email, it came through, but that doesn't mean that I've had a chance to go through everything in detail as soon as I get that email. So some common ways that points may be lost for submitting the incorrect item. If you submit the incorrect financial audit or A133 audit, and incorrect meaning not the most recent. So I keep track every year of the audits that you submit. So a tip on kind of how to make sure you're submitting the right one. Look back at what you submitted last year and see what audit you submitted last year, and then determine whoever you need to talk to within your agency. Is this still our most recent audit, or do we have another one that has since been completed? If you have a more recent one, then submit that one. So if you, in kind of the example I give at the bottom. So say in last year's competition, you submitted to me your audit for your fiscal year that ended June 2023. And then in this year's competition, I see you also submitted your June of 2023 audit. If I reached out to you and said, hey, this is the same audit that you submitted last year, is this accurate? Your agency comes back and says, yep, we do not yet have our June 2024 audit completed. I'll say, okay, that's great. However, if you do come back and say, oh, nope, we do have actually our June 2024 audit completed, then that is the one that needs to be submitted, and you would have a deduction of points because you did not initially submit the correct one. So again, I would just ask that you be mindful of making sure that you are submitting the most recently completed one. And when it comes to these audits, I know that there are times where you may get a draft audit from your auditor that still needs to go to your board, and there may be some back and forth. If that is where you are in your audit process, I'm not asking for that one. I'm not asking you to submit something to me that has not yet been vetted and kind of approved by your board of directors. So in that case, the most current audit you may have may be last year's. I know it's a different time frames that it takes for these audits to be completed. Sometimes they take longer than other times. Additional points where people sometimes lose points, and this was kind of referenced earlier, is submitting the incorrect signature page with the project application. Again, I kind of alluded to this earlier. This primarily impacts agencies that may have multiple projects. Please, I need one signature page for every project, and please be sure that the project name on that signature page clearly identifies the name of the project that is with. So another kind of thing to keep in mind, the attachment for documenting a person with lived experience on your board or decision-making entity. For the most part, folks are good at clearly documenting it. I just want to point out some things that have happened in the past is that an agency may submit a board roster that lists, just lists names and maybe an organization or a company that the person is affiliated with. If there's no other way that's indicated who that individual is, like the person with the lived experience, I'm not going to know just from this list of names who is the person with lived experience. So if you do submit a board roster, highlight that individual's name, put a note by it, somehow indicate that this is the individual with lived experience. But again, as we've done in the past, if that is information that you or that individual prefers to keep confidential, you can submit a letter on your agency's letterhead just confirming that you do have a person with lived experience on your board or other decision-making entity in your organization. Not asking you to violate anyone's privacy if they prefer to keep that confidential. Okay, so the couple of questions. Do we need to submit resolution of findings for city and HUD for financial and programmatic time periods? And specifically, what document do we need to submit with the findings? So the time frame for any documentation that we're looking for is from, again, March of 2024 to March of 2025. And yes, if you have resolved any findings that you had with HUD or the city, I do need documentation that those findings have been resolved. That's what I'm going to be looking for. So I hope that answered it. And do I want the entire 51-page APR? Yes, just send me the whole thing. I know that may feel again, like a lot. I would rather have you send me the whole thing rather than cutting it short and inadvertently not including pages that do need to be included. So regarding the APR, be sure you're running the APR for the correct HMIS ID number. In one of the appendices, I think it's Appendix B, I list all of the projects with their HMIS number in case you need just kind of a reminder of what the HMIS ID number is. Be sure you're using the correct ID and be sure you're running it for a calendar year 2024. That's different than your project term. We're looking for the calendar year. When you're printing or saving your APR as a PDF, please just make sure that you don't accidentally cut off any columns. Just give it a glance over before you send it to me. You may need to switch things to landscape view. If you need help, if you can't kind of figure it out, let me know and we'll walk you through it. But again, really what I'm asking is just make sure it's legible, make sure nothing is cut off so that I can kind of see what's there. The APR is the only piece of data that you have to run. There is other data that we will pull from HMIS, but that's something, again, that we'll do on our end. All that you need to generate is that APR for your project. If you need assistance from the HMIS team for any of these aspects, the link to the help desk is given in the application materials. I can also send it to you separately if needed, but just please note that if you reach out to the help desk after July 17th, I cannot guarantee that they'll be able to respond to your request by the 24th. So ask that you plan accordingly. Also, just like to remind folks that we are looking at data that at this point is 12 to 18 months old, right? We're looking at data from 2024. So our expectation is that, number one, that you have been reviewing and keeping up on your data. That's the purpose of those audits, those quarterly audits, why we have the agency admin meetings, all those good things. So our assumption is that this data that we are pulling from 2024 is complete and accurate. We are already starting to pull some of these reports from HMIS that we are using. So the assumption is that the data that's there is accurate. All right, I'm going to do some email submission tips. Just really, again, because everything is being emailed to me, we have not yet come up with a better system for you to get this stuff to us. I feel like this is, although this is still better for those of you who've been around, you know, you used to have to come to our office and hand stuff to me in person. So while that was fun and I enjoyed seeing all of your smiling faces, yes, I remember. Oh, Linda used to always come with a big stack of materials, and that was great. Yes, I used to give you a receipt. All right, back in the day. All right, some of us are revealing how long we've been around. Everything's being emailed to me because, quite frankly, I don't want everyone to. Well, first of all, as you can tell, I'm working from home, so I'm not going to have you all come to my house and drop this off. Anyway, here's how you're going to email it. A couple of tips. You can, and this is really going to depend on how many applications you have to submit. Some of you may have more attachments if you have like monitoring reports or what have you. So these different tips, the different methods that you use, it's really going to depend on kind of the volume of materials that you have to submit. So you can either, tip number one, you can put everything in one PDF and scan it all in as one big PDF file. Name it something obvious that I'll know what it is and email that PDF to me. That is one way to do it. Another way to do it, and I kind of give some screenshots here, is to, this is an example of an agency that had, they had an organizational application and then they had 3 separate project applications. So they put all of their organizational applications, their audit reports, their organizational application into one zip file, and then each of the individual project applications and APR attachment had its own zip file, and then everything was clearly labeled in terms of what the project name was. So that's another example of how to do it. Similarly, you can submit multiple emails. So this is an agency who likewise had multiple renewal projects. So you can see they sent me a total of 3 emails. They clearly labeled this is email 2 of 3. And then in the title of their email, they gave the name of the project, right? So this is agency ABC project XYZ email 2 of 3. And then everything attached to this email was specific to that project. So this is another example of how to do it. So I'm fine with receiving multiple emails from one agency. I'm fine with receiving, separate zip files. What I just ask is that you label everything clearly, and so that it is clear kind of what project this is for, what organization it's for. Okay, let me go over to our website. I'll drop this link to the website in the chat. You may want to bookmark this website. Today's recording and the slides will eventually be posted here. The packet of materials that I just went over is here, the PDF form. The application form itself is there in a Word document. The self-scoring tools are still in development. They will be posted by the end of the day on Friday. These are supplemental tools that you can use that go into detail for the individual projects on how we do the scoring. Like, it really gets into the details of how we do the math, essentially, what question from the APR we're taking the data from, how we do the division, multiplication, all of that to get the score. So sorry, I don't have those done quite yet, but again, it will be there. My goal is by the end of the day tomorrow. And there's a different self-scoring tool for the different project types. So please just, if you do want to look at those, be sure you're looking at the correct one. As we go along with the competition this year, in addition to communicating things through email, I'll also be posting stuff on the website here. So again, just recommend that you kind of bookmark that site for future reference. Okay, I can see I already have this date wrong. It's July, whatever, it's July 10th today, not July 8th. Okay. I think that is the end. So I will take any additional questions that folks may have.
Amanda, I just had a concern about from last year, the scoring for leavers with income in the transitional homes that are transferring to rapid rehousing. Has there been a change to that? Because they may not have, if they've got a short stay in transitional, it may not have increased their income or, but
Right.
over to rapid housing, and that time may have increased their income.
Yes, yes, right. And this is for the joint component projects,
Right,
where someone's
right.
yes. So I think where we landed with this, and I will double check, and if I need to get back and clarify this, I could do so with both you and AFG, because I know you both have those joint component types, well, and our YHTP program. But I think if I recall when I looked at this, how it worked out is because so essentially we combine the data from both the TH and the rapid APRs, which I know is also a little clunky because of the way that you have that the data entry works. But I think because we combined it, I don't know how I want to say this. It seemed like, what am I trying to say? On the one hand, it's not so easy to separate out, because some people in your transitional housing program may just exit to non-rapid rehousing, right? But we don't really know who that is.
Absolutely, right.
But they also may, move to rapid rehousing. So here's what I will commit to. When we are looking at the data for these joint component projects, for yours, AFG, and the YHDP project, as we're looking at that, if it looks like the data is coming through in a way that doesn't make sense, right? It looks like things are being skewed, we will take another closer look at that. And if we need to, I want to say, do something different or figure out a different way to pull that data, we'll do so, and we'll communicate that. That makes sense.
Okay. Thank you.
Sort of a vague answer. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Other questions? thanks, Nona, thanks for answering those questions in the chat for Matt. Okay. Again, I want to emphasize, please reach out to me if you have any questions as you get into this. This is the type of process where I definitely welcome those questions and, want to kind of keep that communication open. You have my email, you can feel free to call. Yeah, and if or when we get additional information from HUD on what's happening this year with the competition, we will communicate that as we can and as it comes. Right now, this is sort of where we're at with things. Okay. I think we got all the questions in the chat. All right. Thank you all for your time this afternoon, and we'll be in touch. I'll talk to you all later.